it's Crystal
and Hannah Neal.
Welcome back to another episode of the EV Life podcast. Today I talked to Brian Kingston, who is the CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association.
Yeah, so this episode's all about EV rebates and incentives. And if you don't know, a lot of the rebates federally and also provincially in different provinces have been paused in recent months. And so we talk with Brian just to find out how this is affecting automakers, how it's affecting consumer behavior. And he even, talks a little bit about the tariffs that have been recently introduced and how that also adds to the mix of everything going on and the impact that has.
Yeah, so it was a really candid conversation, and I think interesting perspectives on incentives and how they drive consumer behavior. So how about we just go straight to that interview? And if you have any thoughts on this episode or any of our episodes, you can always share those with us in the EV Life group on the AMA mobile app. I hope you enjoy my interview with Brian Kingston, CEO of CVMA. Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So can we start with just you telling our audience who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm Brian Kingston. I'm the president of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, the CVMA, and we represent Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis in Canada. And our overarching objective is to ensure that the auto industry continues to thrive, grow, succeed in this country. So we bring members together and convene and develop policies that ultimately ensure that we have a growing automotive industry and more people employed in the sector and a framework that makes it competitive for new investment in this country.
Yeah. And part of that is, again, bringing awareness around electric vehicles. And so that is specifically what we wanted to talk to you about today, but more specifically about the iZEV rebates. So can you share a little bit about those rebates and how they contributed to the growth of the Canadian EV market?
Sure. Well, just a couple of points to note with respect to the growth of EV investments in the market in Canada. Since 2020, there's been over $40 billion in new automotive investment into Canada, unprecedented levels. And the majority of that has been dedicated to EV assembly and the battery supply chain. And what we've seen over the past decade is an increasing amount of electric vehicles available to Canadians. So there were 3 models in market in 2012. And right now, as we speak, there's over 100 models in virtually every size and segment. So we're seeing more and more offerings for Canadian consumers. Now, to make that transition to electric possible, incentives play a very important role. And purchase incentives, like the federal iZEV, help convince consumers to make the switch to electric. And the reason that's important is this is still a new and developing technology, and there is a price gap between an electric vehicle and an internal combustion engine vehicle. Right. And that price gap can be in excess of $10,000, depending on the model of vehicle. So incentives help with the transition. They help increase adoption, and the iZEV program has been quite important. And it's offered $5,000 to consumers who purchase a battery electric vehicle. And then when it was stacked on top of provincial incentives, it became quite powerful. And so Quebec is a great example where they had additional incentives offered, and you saw high levels of uptake. So the iZEV has been key. And remember that the federal government has mandated EV sales 20% in 2026, all the way up to 100% by 2035. You simply can't get to those levels of adoption without some sort of incentive in the market in these early days of adoption.
Right. And so, like you mentioned, like those incentives are very important, but that federal rebate is paused right now. So can you tell us what are some of the immediate effects that automakers are experiencing as a result of the pause, and how does it impact their production and sales strategies?
Well, the pause has been extremely challenging for the automotive industry. First of all, it was not properly communicated by the federal government, so it came as a surprise. And then the program effectively, over the course of a weekend, disappeared. And what we've seen happen is exactly what you would expect. And we've seen this in other markets. Ontario had a strong provincial incentive at one point. When you remove an incentive from the market, people reduce demand for EVs. So just to give you an example of how significant the drop-off was, in December of 2024, EV sales had reached 21.1% across Canada. The incentive then was removed in January, and in February, sales have fallen through the floor. They fell to 8%.
Oh, wow.
Canada
That's a huge drop.
So it's a massive drop, and it's quite concerning for industry because obviously they plan to sell more of these vehicles on the assumption that the incentive will be in place. But the federal mandate requires sales of 20% next year. At the current market dynamics, there is just simply no path to that target. And that has bad outcomes for manufacturers, of course, but also consumers, because companies, they have to comply with this regulation. And the one way to do that is to reduce the vehicles available for sale in Canada, particularly on the gas-powered side of the ledger. So we're not in a good place, and incentives and a return of incentives are quite important if these targets are going to be achieved.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying is unless we have these incentive programs reintroduced, you don't think that we'll be able to hit those mandated targets by, next year. It's not that far away.
No, not at current demand levels. And just to further complicate the picture, automakers have put $1.2 trillion of investment into electrification. The objective is to get to price parity with gas-powered vehicles. And that's why, incentives are never something that need to remain in place forever. No one has ever made that case. This is to help with this early adoption when the price gap exists. However, the major challenge we're seeing right now, of course, is U.S. tariffs. So while progress was being made on reducing the price gap, we now have tariffs on the automotive sector across North America, 25%. Canada has retaliated on the Americans with a 25% tariff. On top of that, the Americans have announced a tariff of 145% on China, and China just happens to control about 80% of the global battery supply chain. So the net effect here is the cost of everything is going up. We're estimating that new vehicle prices will go up by at a minimum $4,700 US. And you could see it going up much higher than that. Some estimates suggesting as high as $12,000 US. So unfortunately, we have a number of headwinds. Government has pulled the EV incentive. They're mandating EV sales, and yet prices and costs throughout the supply chain are going up, which will likely slow demand for electric vehicles.
So the incentives are needed now more than ever, just with those tariffs and the increase of pretty much everything in the auto sector. Do you see those rebates coming back anytime soon?
I think it really depends on the outcome of the election. We've seen different parties propose incentivizing and reinstituting the iZEV program. There's also uncertainty around just the economic situation. Mm-hmm. If we do end up plunging into a recession or worse, governments will be dedicating most of their fiscal firepower to supporting the Canadian economy. So I think there's a chance they come back, but I wouldn't necessarily count on it. On top of that, the provincial incentives, British Columbia's incentive has become weaker and weaker, despite the most aggressive EV sales mandate in North America. And in Quebec, they paused their incentive late last year and just announced in the recent budget that it's going to come back at a lower level, but it will expire in 2027. And just to give you an example of how powerful these incentives can be, when Quebec said it was going to be pausing and then lowering its incentive amount, sales in December of 2024 spiked up to almost 50% EV. And then with the pause in February, they have fallen to 9.6% of total vehicle sales. So it just has a massive impact on consumer behavior in the EV market.
Just coming back to those tariffs, though, with the rising cost of just cars in general, do you think the rebates are enough to compensate for those additional costs?
It all depends. It all depends on where these tariffs go and how long they stay in place. Unfortunately, U.S. trade policy changes by sometimes the hour. So we just have no certainty what will be enforced and how long it could be enforced. But look, I mean, if we're in a world where you've got tariffs of that size and scale on China, other key components into EVs, think about semiconductors and electronics that are coming from Asia. If those countries are facing major tariffs on product coming into the U.S., a $5,000 incentive in an environment where vehicle prices are going up by in excess of $10,000, sure, it helps, but we've got a pretty dire situation on the horizon. And just to give you a sense, if prices go that high, we're looking at forecasts that would suggest that new vehicle sales in Canada and the U.S. will decrease by 2 million units this year alone. So this is a real serious situation for the auto industry and of course the electrification transition as well.
Yeah, there are a lot of unknowns when it comes to just the automotive sector, not just electric vehicles, but in general. Is there anything that the consumer can do proactively, or is it kind of a wait and see what happens sort of situation?
I mean, look, it's a challenging time for consumers because whenever there's the threat of recession, a vehicle is your second largest purchase after a home. So you tend to see people pushing off decisions like purchasing a new car, be it gas or electric, when there is economic uncertainty. That said, on a more positive note, this transition is happening. The technology is getting better and better every single year. EV ranges are getting higher, and you're just seeing offerings in every possible segment. And including in Canada, what's particularly of interest to consumers here is you're seeing more and more electrified pickup trucks, which are hugely popular in this country. So as a consumer,
particularly in Alberta.
In Alberta, exactly. The options are so good and getting better every year. So as a consumer, I think you're only going to see more choice. The key is, I always recommend that anyone that's thinking about an electric vehicle, think through first what your ability to home charge is, because that makes a massive difference. And then experiment a little bit, see what the charging network looks like on your main commutes. And make sure you factor that all in before you make the decision to go electric. But I've been driving one for the past year, and it's phenomenal how convenient it is once you've got that charging in place.
Can I ask you which EV you drive?
Yes, I've got a Chevy Blazer electric.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
And how long have you been driving the EV?
I've had this one for about a year, and then before that, I had a plug-in hybrid, a Chrysler Pacifica. So it's been amazing. And once initially I was a garage orphan. I did not have charging at my home. And that is a challenge. And this is something that we've been flagging with governments, that you really have to give people options if they don't have a charger at home. So I would go and use public charging, which becomes an inconvenience because you're trying to find places and sometimes there's waits and lineups. But once you have that home charging installed, I don't even think about the battery charge in my car. And compared to having a gas-powered vehicle where you're always thinking about where, if you got to go fill the tank up, it's just an afterthought. It's always ready to go, which is amazingly convenient. So it's been fantastic.
Well, thanks for sharing that, and thanks for coming on and chatting with us. Before I let you go, though, I do want to ask if there are any alternative policies or solutions that the CVMA recommends to continue advancing electrification. Yes,
we've got a few things. First of all, get rid of EV mandates. It's not a good policy. People don't like to be told what they can and can't buy. The options are here. We have to focus on helping consumers switch. So two things need to be done. First of all, incentives, as we've discussed, are really important. And there are other ways to incentivize electrification. You don't have to necessarily offer cash for purchase. One thing you could do is you could remove the sales tax on the purchase of an electric vehicle. It's these little policies which nudge people to purchasing an EV over a gas-powered vehicle. So I think there are other options that could be explored to help reduce that price gap and incentivize more people to electric. And then secondly, charging infrastructure. It has to be front and center. And I enjoy driving my EV around the city, around Ottawa. But when I take road trips, which I do frequently for work to Toronto, the network is just not where it needs to be. We don't have enough high-speed infrastructure, and there are issues always with reliability. I'm just blown away how often you approach a charger and find that something is not working. So we're asking government to really take this seriously and put us on track to have a world-class charging network across this country.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insights. And we're looking forward to seeing the work that the CVMA does, and just see where this goes in this ever-changing environment. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the EV Life podcast. Make sure that you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you'd like to join the conversation, you can always do so in the EV Life group on the AMA mobile app. We'll talk to you in the next episode.